Here we are betting on Sports America with Mark Hichar. Welcome.
Thank you.
It's great to have you here, and let's talk about the DOJ opinion and how it might affect payment providers.
Sure. Well, as you know, the DOJ opinion decided that the Wire Act applies not only to sports betting, but to all types of betting. And that reversed a 2011 opinion which had limited the Wire Act just to sports betting. And what it does essentially is prohibit bets or wagers and information that entitles the recipient to winnings from bets or wagers from crossing state lines. And the effect on payment processors would be perhaps as an aider and abetter, because the Wire Act is limited to businesses that are in the business of betting or wagering. And in my view, payment processors are not in the business of betting or wagering, so they're not directly affected. However, under an aiding and abetting theory, if you are considered to be aiding and abetting, you're subject to the same penalties as if you were the principal. So my concern would be, and this is a concern that, that because of the ambiguity of the Wire Act and because of the ambiguity of what it means to be aiding and abetting, that payment processors could possibly be considered to be aiding and abetting in the event their customer is in violation of the Wire Act. And there's precedent from the 11th Circuit under a different statute, the telemarketing fraud statute, where a payment processor was held in that case under a different law, but it was held to be aiding and abetting a violation of its customer merely by providing payment processing services.
What's behind the questioning of this?
Well, the Wire Act is a very old statute. It was enacted in 1961, before satellite communications, before internet communications, and it was essentially passed because, to assist states in going after organized crime. And one of the ways that organized crime made money at that time was through illegal gambling operations. The idea that there would be the proliferation of legal gambling throughout the country wasn't imagined at that time. Only in Nevada was there lawful sports betting, other than on horse races, but only in Nevada, except for horse racing. And there was not, as there is today, gaming in many states. So that's why the Wire Act came about. But the rather unique thing about the Wire Act, as opposed to other federal gambling statutes, is that the Wire Act doesn't carve out an exception for state-authorized gambling. It applies even to gambling that might be state-authorized.
And I guess part of that is technology has changed so much since the Wire Act was developed.
That's exactly right, and payment technologies in particular have changed so much. So you have electronic wallets that may be set up to facilitate wagering. They can be funded through ACH transfer. They can be funded through credit cards. They can be funded through debit cards. So, that's part of it, and as well as the communication itself that travels, as I mentioned, by satellite, by cell phone, by data over voice. So there are so many changes in the way we communicate from 1961. At that time, you could actually determine the flow of the communication because there were actual wires carrying the communication, but that's not true today.
What's the solution?
Well, the ideal solution would be legislative, but I don't see that happening in the immediate future. As to the question of whether the Wire Act should be limited to sports betting, there's already litigation that's been brought in New Hampshire, and there may be a decision as early as June clarifying what the Wire Act means, and it may restrict the Wire Act back to where it was in 2011. We don't know, we'll have to wait and see, and I would suspect there might be an appeal of whatever decision comes out of that.
It doesn't seem to be breaking the momentum of what we see here today around sports.
No, it doesn't, and I don't expect it will, particularly with respect to sports, because one area of unambiguous unambiguity was that the Wire Act applies to sports betting. So operators have been planning their systems to comply with the Wire Act from day one.
And meanwhile, we have almost every major sports league partnering.
That is a difference from where we were a year ago as well. If you'll recall, the suit that resulted in the striking down of the PASPA, the government was joined by several of the leagues. Now that the statute has been struck down, the leagues, many of them, have had a change of view with respect to sports betting.
Should payment providers be concerned?
I think they should be watching cautiously what happens with respect to these Wire Act decisions because of this possibility, and I don't want to paint it as more serious than it is, but the possibility of aiding and abetting. In many times, I think payment processors are not that closely partnered with the customers that they could be seen as aiding and abetting, but in other cases they might be. It depends on how closely they work with their customers.
How do you define how the communication is working between state lines?
Well, the Wire Act, that's actually an open question. Does the Wire Act cover intermediate routing? So for example, it's easy to determine where a transmission might begin. It's easy to determine where it ends, but it's not easy to determine where it goes in between those 2 points. And a question is, does the Wire Act apply to that intermediate routing, which, as you point out, if you're talking about satellite or internet communications, could travel anywhere, and it's difficult to determine, if at all possible, where that communication goes.
What happens in the next 12 months?
I think you'll see litigation with respect to the Wire Act, as we're seeing in New Hampshire. I don't foresee legislative changes in the next 12 months because we're going into an election period, in which case attention will be elsewhere. So perhaps this in the next 12 months we'll look to the courts to resolve. Litigation
can take a long time.
It can, and it did for New Jersey to strike down the PASPA. That was an effort started in 2012, but hopefully this won't take so long.
So meanwhile, business as usual.
And from the looks of this conference, expansion as well.
Mark, before we say farewell, any final thoughts to share with the audience?
I think with respect to sports betting, you're going to see continued expansion throughout the country. There's bills in Indiana, in Colorado, there's live sports betting in Rhode Island, West Virginia, New Mexico, and New Jersey, obviously. So I think you'll see continued expansion.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.